Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is László Jakaborcsos. I'm the Vice President of Arts and Culture at Brooklyn Public Library. With my team, we present all the... sorry, this is one of those glitches. So welcome, everyone. So normally this book launch, Laura Rajkovic's fantastic book, should take place on an industry platform, right? On a, let's say, on a museum platform. But it doesn't. It doesn't because the problems, I should say the questions, are larger than we believe any industry platform can mitigate. But thank God we have libraries. Since I'm working for a library, for Brooklyn Public Library for 5 years now, I saw the platform changing, really enormously changing. And I shall say, after coming from, especially coming from Europe, that this is not a given. This is, regardless how critical we are of our cultural institutions, the fact that we have libraries in America is a major factor. These are actually town squares for bold, really uninhibited, and for most of all, free conversations. This is not a given. And without exaggeration, I think that libraries are really the last resort of American culture, especially after reading Laura's book. It really is a fantastic addition to this culture and a huge opportunity. But in order to question the status quo, we really need allies. And one of our beloved allies is Laura Rajkovic. Laura, thanks so much for working with us, doing this book launch with us, with Aruna da Souza. Aruna, thanks so much. And with this, I'm handing it over to my colleague, Cora Fisher, who is the Curator of Visual Art at the library, introducing Laura and Aruna. And thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Cora.
Thank you so much, Jakub. And we're so happy to be with all of you this evening. I have the great pleasure to welcome Laura Rajkovic, author of Culture Strike, Art and Museums in a Time of Protest, published by Verso Books. Laura is a New York-based writer and curator who recently served as interim director of the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art. She was a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow at the Bellagio Center and was awarded the inaugural Emily H. Tremaine Journalism Fellowship for Curators at Hyperallergic. While director of the Queens Museum from 2015 to 2018, Rajkovic co-curated Mel Chin All Over the Place, a multi-borough survey of the artist's work, and many other notable projects. She's also the author of At the Lightning Field and co-editor of Assuming Boycott, Resistance, Agency, and Cultural Production. We've been so fortunate at BPL to co-organize the Art and Society Census Project this past year with you, Laura, and you have been an absolute dream collaborator. And we're very delighted to host this first of what's sure to become a series of rich ongoing discussions raised by this book. We're also delighted to welcome Aruna D'Souza, who will be leading tonight's conversation. She is writer and critic whose work appears regularly in the New York Times and 4columns.org, where she's a member of the editorial advisory board. Her most recent book, White Walling: Art, Race, and Protest in Three Acts, was named one of the best art books of 2018 by the New York Times. She's also the editor of Lorraine O'Grady's Writing in Space, 1973 to 2018 by Duke University Press, and is co-curator of the retrospective of O'Grady's work, Both and, which opened in March 2021 at the Brooklyn Museum and runs through July 18th. I encourage you all to see the show if you haven't already, or to see it again. After the conversation between Laura and Aruna, we're going to open out with writer Ken Chen and curator, social justice activist, and educator Dr. Kelly Morgan, who joins us from Atlanta. Thank you both for being here. Unfortunately, Helen Molesworth won't be able to join us this evening. Then, following their responses to Culture Strike, we welcome you in the audience to add to the conversation using the chat function. So without further ado, Laura Rajkovic and Aruna D'Souza.
Thank you so much, Cora. And thank you, Aruna. You know, I'm one of your biggest fans, always have been, always will be. I'm just so delighted that we're doing this together.
I'm so pleased to be asked. Thank you. And it's such a rich topic of conversation, and it was a real pleasure to sort of see your take on everything. So I am going to start by asking like the biggest possible question, which is, why are museums such a flashpoint these days? And like what accounts for this? What is it about museums that make them a kind of locus of the kinds of debates and protests that we've seen over the past years, although, you know, it's a long history, obviously.
Sure. I think that's a really important question to be asking right now. And I have a number of different answers to that question. The first is that I think people care about museums. People care about what their cultural spaces do and say, and how they do them and how they say them. And art has a particular power to communicate that I think people want to engage with. I think that if people didn't care about what museums did and how they did it, then there wouldn't be any protest or any kind of focus on them. So in some senses, it's interesting because over the last 18 months, obviously, there's been additional thinking added to the book that wasn't there before. And I was sort of lucky and glad that I had that time to reflect during the pandemic and during the protests about what meaning that might have in relationship to cultural space. And my biggest conclusion out of that was that museums and cultural spaces need to think about protests and unionization efforts and other kinds of sort of dramatic action that really frames demands that people are making as forms of radical care for those spaces. Because indeed, when else do we as art workers get to hear so directly what people want? You know, and so I think that is a really essential aspect of it, and of why now, because culture writ large is theoretically represented by museums. And so if we don't see ourselves in those spaces, or we don't see them as addressing the urgencies that we feel are important, those are demands that are going to be made. Just to interrupt, there's some noise happening outside my window, and if it's interfering with, you can't hear it. Okay, good. Great.
But it feels like you were in a particularly, in a sense, like you had a particular bird's eye view, or both up close and far away view of a lot of the issues you were writing about. And as a result, I think, you know, one of the things that really interested me was that the book is written, in a sense, in a very personal way. There's a lot of you in the book. And so I'm wondering what motivated you to write it in that way, and write it in a way that was so personal. What does that, what form, the form of the book, what does that sort of
Well,
mean?
yeah, this is a good one. I think for me, it was about sharing what my experiences had been, because I felt like I had been on such a roller coaster ride the last few years before writing the book, that I thought if those experiences could be useful to other folks who are maybe dealing with the same questions or trying to think about things in similar ways, that might be interesting or useful. I also thought I also think that cultural spaces and museums are such perfect mirrors to the rest of society, in terms of the inequities that they represent, from wealth inequity to racial politics to real cultural difference. Those are really mirrors. Museums are really mirrors. And in that sense, I thought, well, if I could write a book that has, that's really written for not just insiders, for people who know all of the inside baseball stuff, if it was written for more of a general audience, that might also prove useful to giving us some clues about how we might address these inequities in the larger society. And even maybe more importantly than all of that, I really wanted to take a stab at connecting what some of these protests and controversies I felt were about at the core, and to try to say, well, these may be specific things that happened because certain people made certain very specific decisions, but they're also tied to much larger structural questions that relate not only to the specific works on view or what a museum might exhibit, in its galleries, but also to the structural underpinnings, the way that museums operate, who makes decisions, when they make them, how they make them, what people are in the room to begin with, which people could be in the room if somebody thought about it differently, and to really kind of break open this space that I had been deeply invested in as an insider and then also as an outsider. And so I thought, let me try to balance those different sets of knowledges and really think through how to get the most out of that experience in a way that was as direct as possible.
It's funny that you say that museums are a mirror, because I think sometimes they're a funhouse mirror, the kind that stretch you out. The people on the, it's not, when you talk about wealth inequality, for example, right? Like, it's not just you have rich people and you have people who aren't being paid minimum wage. You have some of the richest people in the country on boards of directors, and then you have people who are not being paid a living wage. And so even on that level, right, that when you talk about race inequality as well, right, like the museum industry is shockingly white in terms of its staffing for any sort of programming or decision-making roles, right? So it's like, it's the museums are interesting because they're whatever the problems that we're dealing with society, like here you seem to have them like, exaggerated to the nth degree. And then in addition to all of that, there's this whole weight of tradition and this whole sort of, sort of discourse of, the care for objects, the preservation of history, the preservation of culture, the definition of culture, right? And so that museums become a space that, it seems to me, become even more, they become you know, in addition to being like a real institutions with like economic and political and ideological and all sorts of, you know, kind of aspects, they've got this huge symbolic weight that, say, IBM doesn't have, right? Like that a regular corporation doesn't have, even though in some ways they operate just like corporations, right?
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is what you're talking about is the power that cultural institutions leverage around storytelling and where that leads. You know, I really think one of the most interesting aspects of the undoing and redoing that I'm interested in within cultural space is the kind of narrowness and the relationship to this kind of neutral position that I'm trying to debunk, because what you're describing is the commitment to a very narrow space of what we imagine this important culture to be, that comes largely out of a very particular positionality or set of positionalities that are highly classed and raced and gendered and all of the rest of it. And so you get these perspectives that are really addressing such a small segment of creativity, of cultural production, that one of my big questions going in is like, well, what do we do with everything that's outside of whatever that thing is that was desirable to be collected because it explicated a colonial position, or it reinforced the power of a particular group of individuals over, others. The formation of cultural institutions in the United States, mirroring those of Europe, was a move that served to create cultural and international power for a young nation, a young settler colonial nation. It was about building status, as much as it was about preserving culture. And so, when you begin to, I think, to me, it's not necessarily, there are all kinds of uncomfortable truths in that. But without acknowledging those truths and actually confronting them within the itself, you can't really do all of the "we're for everyone," this kind of neoliberal kind of like the museum is for everybody. You can't be that space unless you confront those inherent realities that the museum represents and embodies. And those things, as I was saying, are not just ones of representation in the galleries or how certain work is shown, or whether Benin bronzes are put on view or returned and what they say on the labels, all of which is very important, but it's also how you run the museum and who's in charge and who does what.
I think that, one of the things that's interesting is that I think there's been rightly so much emphasis on who's in the positions of power within museums, but very little talk about how you actually reorganize the structures of power of museums, right? It's one of the things that I've always found really interesting in US museums is the role, say, that education departments have played in American museums. They are largely treated within American museums as service departments for the curatorial. Every department is treated as a service department for the curatorial vision of the museum. And as a result, education departments, and they are also, maybe not surprisingly, because of that power relation, they are also where some of our most important Black museum professionals have come from, right? Lowery Stokes Sims was in the museum education department at the Metropolitan Museum before she was a curator. Linda Good Bryant worked in the education department at the Metropolitan Museum before she ended up running one of the most important galleries for Black-run and galleries focusing on Black avant-garde art in New York, right? But one of the problems around this question of power relations is that if they're just the service department for the curatorial staff, then education departments get these impossible tasks thrown at them, which is like this neoliberal vision of we want diverse audiences, everyone should come to the museum, everyone should feel welcome. So please convince everybody that they really need to be fascinated by Donald Judd or Jasper Johns, right? Like make this relevant for people whose cultural interests, cultural backgrounds, political interests might be absolutely in different directions, right? And so that's one of the things that I think is sort of often so missing from conversations around institutions is how the power is organized within the institution, not just who is sitting in those positions of power. Because I think that, the risk, of course, is that you get incredibly talented Black, Indigenous, other people of color in those positions that are then hemmed in by the institution themselves in terms of what they can do.
I think that's a huge problem, and it's one that's going to become even more obvious and poignant as people begin to follow through on these DEI plans that they have, which, will take a different level of work, on people of color to take on extra in order to make it work within these structures. And so, one of the things that I'm interested in, a couple of structural things that I think could be very interesting. And look, this is not one size fits all, obviously. The Met is really different from laundromat projects. Like they have different projects that they need to work on, each of them, and they do it in a very different way. They have different audiences and desires, but cultural institutions have to keep trying things on for size and try and figure out what might work. And so, for me, there are a couple of things. One of them is related to hierarchy, and that, and also about the power of individual people within the museum. And that goes back to, sort of late capitalist ideas about the individual and the genius of the individual and the kind of Marlboro Man sensibility of like the kind of genius museum director, genius singular curator, when in point of fact, we all know that the only way that a museum can function is in a profoundly collective way, that, if you don't have the people who clean the bathrooms, you can't open the museum. Like, we all know that. And we all participate in that, but it's just that the value proposition of what those people do is unequally viewed by society, right? And so, there is a heavy weighting, not only through like salary and compensation and benefits and those things, but also just in the public imagination. A museum is the director or is the curator in a way that's just not reality. And I have to say, like, even as a very self-conscious museum director at the Queen's Museum, I knew I was expected to act that way in order to bring home the bacon, literally. Like I had to seduce people to think that I was that one superhuman person because I knew that I needed to do that to raise the money. Right. It wasn't comfortable for me, but I knew that I sort of had to perform that. But what if we didn't do that? What if we talked about the museum as the profoundly collective thing that it is? And what if we reverse the hierarchies, even specifically in our minds? Because I think like a lot of the hemming in around the imagination of the museum is done by the way that capitalism operates within the cultural space, the way that racism functions within the cultural space. We have to imagine these spaces differently and then operate in that zone. So like, what if we imagined hierarchies where the people doing the frontline work and actually, in it up to their elbows, if they had people who supported them rather than the other way around, where the director has an assistant. Well, what if the director's the assistant to the programmers? What if that in our imaginations is flipped? right? And or what if we have multiple directors? I also think that the kind of outsized differential in compensation comes straight out of the corporate model between directors and the rest of their staffs. And there's this whole thing where museum trustees feel like they're competing with other institutions to get the best director and all of that. And so there's a certain competition there, and they know what they're paying their own CEOs or what they're being paid when it compares to their own staff. So that just seeps in really deeply. But I think it's also an impossible task to expect that one singular person to be able to do all of the various things that a museum director is asked to do. And so what if that were a more collective project explicitly, that it wasn't like, say, Aruna, you and I are co-directors of something, and, you take care of the curatorial work and the fundraising, and I take care of the administration and operations. No, I want us to negotiate those things, because I think each of our positionalities, or even if we had a third person in there, what would happen? Our personalities, our sets of knowledge, all of that in our negotiation would make a better thing.
It's funny because the dual directors or the multiple directors model so far has been tried out exactly in the way that you don't want to do it, with one person doing this, one person doing that. And it's been almost entirely put in service of propping up mediocre white men who can't do the job singularly, and so need someone to sort of, instead of museum boards being able to say, this guy is just not up to the job, they bring in the, and those sorts of stories within museums of the ways in which, I think that museums really, and this again, reflective of a lot of corporate spaces, right? Museums imagine that things can only be done one way until a white, more often than not straight man is in the position, needs assistance, and then suddenly things change, right? And I think that, so what has been so interesting for me during COVID has been seeing how nimble and mobile museums can actually be, that in ways that they have refused to before. And it starts to make it clear that it's not logistics, it's actually just resistance, right? And I think,
or just expectations and what people are used to. I think just in some senses cracking that open. I think it's also resistance to that. Well, who's accountable? And I don't like the idea of 3 people or 2 people, but I also, and I also think in that, what is really, there are a couple of really important jobs that the boards have been handed, and one of them is choosing the director of the museum. And I think that the increasing distance between boards of directors and staffs has really made that process much more challenging, because there isn't as much kind of common ground. And of course, this is something that the larger society is experiencing, where, people don't use the same parks, they don't go to the same schools, they don't, these divides are getting greater and greater, and it's all that much more visible, as you say, in the museum space. So yeah, I think that that's a big piece of the puzzle and the problem. But I also think it's not about me coming up with the idea that's going to solve it. I actually really believe in the collective process. I think that we need to think about what we want together as cultural workers, as people invested in wanting to see better things in our cultural institutions, which is in part why I embarked with BPL on this art and society census, to kind of understand, okay, well, if we really want to rebalance where the sources of funds come from for our cultural spaces, because obviously the money, the where the money comes from is an issue, and how much of it comes from private individuals. Like, we have to address that. One of the only ways of balancing that is by having an actual national conversation about what culture means in this country, because we don't even have a culture ministry at the federal level. The NEA is this kind of demented, atrophied thing. And it's not, it's not powerful enough. And so what would it mean to have a federal agency actually devoted to cultural policy? What would it mean to have a politically viable percentage of federal taxes going to culture in a meaningful way? How would that change the conversation and rebalance who the museums feel like they're for? I think one of the biggest conceptual problems is that in this idea where we have philanthropy, private philanthropy, that's been enormously generous, but has been given so much power in the cultural sphere, is that regular folks don't feel like they have anything they can say about what's in the museum, even though it's meant to be there as a public good, even though we've already gifted the tax deduction in order for that to be made to happen.
Well, I don't agree with that regular people don't think they have a say, because I think that the amount of protests that we've seen around museums show that regular people do think they have a say. The people who don't think that they have a say are museum directors and top level museum staff, right? Like, those are the people who are like, we don't actually have a say because we're getting all our funding from here. But the people who were protesting Sam Durant's piece at the Walker,
that's right.
Protesting Kanders, Warren Kanders being on the board of the Whitney, that they felt really empowered to do what they were going to do, and so I think that's one of the things that I think that when I read the book, I thought I was incredibly struck by the way in which you really love museums, and you are describing these problems that, of course, I'm the burning the bridges kind of person, right? Like, that's just my personality. And so I'm reading it and I'm thinking, this whole system, everything about this system is completely compromised. So why are we thinking about saving museums? And when I go out and people ask me, like, what do we do about museums? How do we change museums? And I'm like, well, first, we make sure that we reorganize our economy so that there's no such thing as a billionaire anymore. Then we get universal single payer healthcare. Then we pay reparations, or not necessarily in that order. Then we pay actual reparations. Then we do this, then we do that. And by the time you get to museum solutions, it's like 12 things down the to-do list, right? Like that in order to that within the current model, even a revision or a tinkering with the current model, that museums will always be compromised. But it feels like, have a bit more hopefulness about the institution itself.
What can I say, Aruna? I'm a glass half full kind of gal. And I guess I've been.
And I'm the knock the glass off the table kind of gal. So,
I mean, I think I guess I am a believer in the diversity of the cultural institution, and I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I do think that there are cultural institutions that are doing really interesting, amazing work that aren't necessarily, that are following different interesting models that could be applied to, more stalwart kind of spaces. whether those places are capable of the kind of radical reform that I'm talking about, I'm not so sure. You know, it's not, that to me is not a foregone conclusion that that every cultural institution will, you know, equally embody new values of, you know, of deep equity. You know, that's not going to happen. I'm not Pollyanna in that sense, but I do think that there are, as there always have been, you know, ways that smaller and more nimble organizations have taught other institutions how to be differently. And I think that there is some incredible work going on out there that that some more established institutions can really learn from. And, you know, to be honest with you, I've never been, you know, I worked at the Guggenheim for, I think, 3 months. That's the biggest institution I've ever worked for, except when I was an intern at the Cloisters when I was in college, you know. And I have to say, like, I love the scale of a place like the Queen's Museum because I think you can make change within those spaces. I love the scale of Creative Time because I think you can do really significant things. So, you know, Creative Time isn't a museum. The Queen's Museum is, but it's sort of a weird museum. So, you know, I guess my definition is broader. You know, I really am not thinking about MoMA and the Met because I think that they fall into like a different category in a sense. And that, you know, just like those kind of more nimble, smaller institutions are performing really radical acts. I mean, I loved the way the Queen's Museum set itself up in collaboration with the food pantry during the pandemic. I thought that was exactly the kind of thing that a cultural space should and could do, especially one oriented such as the Queen's Museum. So, you know, and I guess that's why I still hold that kind of glass half full kind of attitude towards the museum, because I do think that if you engage with the specifics of the cultural space and you think about like what is its reason for being, not everybody is going to have the same reason for being as MoMA. And so it enables those cultural institutions to do the work in a totally different way. And so I like the game of envisioning that, you know, and I think it also kind of de-emphasizes the kind of primacy of the coasts too, or of New York and Los Angeles, because there's so many amazing, you know, mid-size and smaller museums that are doing, you know, or that could be doing really incredible work all over the United States that don't have the same pressures necessarily as, you know, or even wealth as MoMA does. But anyway, so I don't know. I guess like to me, I'm not thinking necessarily of like the iconic spaces. And I agree with you. There are certain things that like really need to be undone, but I'd like to talk about like remaking board structures and, you know, figuring out ways to decouple the fundraising piece from what the board is, and what it does and how it functions. You know, you know, when I was director of the Queen's Museum, you know, there were times when there were super funky things that came up that I knew my board couldn't really help me with because I needed a colleague in the field who had dealt with some weird insurance thing or whatever that, you know, the lawyer and the, you know, the people on my board they would just get freaked out, and that wouldn't be the thing that they were interested, you know, that they could help me resolve. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I wonder what it would mean to have more kind of colleagues on boards to help, you know, sort through things. Anyway, so there are all kinds of things that I think, or like I love what the Laundrette Project had this campaign where they solicited nominations for board members.
Yeah.
Publicly. And I just thought that was just completely brilliant, you know, like let's have a public process. Let's not have this kind of insidery nominating committee, like my friend knows this person and they could do this, you know. How about making that really public and open? And what would that look like? So.
Just before we turn things over to Ken and to Kelly, I wanted to go back to the, you know, because the subtitle of your book is about museums in the age of protest, right? Mm-hmm. And I wanted to go back to the question of protest. And one of the really interesting things I think that you talk about is the way in which what happens outside the museum in relation to protest can work in concert with people within the museum working to change institutions from the inside. And you write this, and I'm just going to quote this from, you say, a call for a public cultural sphere, one that centers equity and imagination, our collective and individual humanity in all its complexity, and invites the polis to struggle together to see and hear one another, is a dream. There is a very real need for this kind of public space today. And because the cultural sphere is where I hope to spend a lot of my time, I hope there is a way for us to enact it. This isn't about institutions versus publics. We are both. We can reclaim our space. And I'd like you to just talk a little bit about this relationship between inside and outside.
Yeah. Yes, that's great. That's a good thing to talk about. So, one of the things that I find that as I was on the outside, one of the things that I started really thinking about was how much agency I had when I was inside, and how sometimes I didn't feel like I had agency on the inside, even if I was in a leadership position, maybe not the top post, but also in other roles. And I think there's, when we are working inside of cultural institutions, it can be really challenging, and we feel like we're in a position of great precarity, but we also have power within our spheres, whatever that might be. And it was funny because I was talking to an extremely senior person at a important cultural institution, and she said something to me like, well, I'm not certain what I could do because my role is only X. And I was like, it was just shocking to me that she would see herself as limited in this capacity, which to me was like, oh my God, you have so much power. How do you not use it? Or not use it in a way that goes beyond your curatorial role, and use it in your hiring practices, because you are making decisions over who's in your department, and those kinds of very material things that one could do. How do you approach people's time off? Whatever the human resources department says, you're somebody's superior, you can give them time off if you want to, if they feel, if you feel like they need it. So I think that there are a lot of so-called best practices that were developed largely to exert different measures of control, and so that stuff can be undone. And so I think there's this power to, going back to the first part of the quote, this power of these parallel projects of undoing that are happening simultaneously in kind of seemingly small ways, on the inside, these people working away who may not be at the top of the hierarchy, kind of stitching their own signatures into the ways that they want to work, right? Even if it's not sanctioned, or even if it's not even appreciated by the institution as such, but they are the institution. They are the person who is making the work happen at some level, so they can choose to do it that way. And then, and then that comes with these other external factors, particularly with the Warren Kanders situation at the Whitney, where you had the staff letter, the role that Hyperallergic played in kind of writing about that staff letter, the role that the rest of the media played in picking up on what was happening, and sometimes those were very uncomfortable relationships. The staff wrote the letter to be internal, it was leaked, it was uncomfortable for the staff because they felt like they were really vulnerable. There was suddenly surveillance internally, then there were the weekly protests, and then finally, the tipping point came when the artists wanted to withdraw their work. And so in a sense, sometimes there was not this, it took me being outside to take a step back to say, okay, well, there were all of these things happening. Some of them were a little bit coordinated. Some of them were actually in conflict, but something happened as a result, right? And so isn't that kind of fascinating. And in a way, you know, I'm interested in that space of how do we negotiate that, or actually not negotiate that so that it can happen? Because I think it was important in that particular case for certain people not to know what the other people were up to, right?
I am going to turn it over to Ken now. Before I do that, I'm just going to let everyone know and let everyone on the panel know there are there's lots of really fantastic questions. So after you and Ken talk, after you and Kelly talk, we will try and get in as many of the questions as possible. And so if you'd like to pose a question, please enter it into the Q&A box. Thank you. And now, Ken, would you like to take it away?
Congratulations, Laura. It's so great to be here celebrating with you. And thank you, Aruna, for all those thoughtful questions. I guess I felt like in a curious position reading this book, and in a way, maybe continuing some of the things you were talking about with Aruna, in that I have the fortune or misfortune of being the panelist who also was a former executive director of a alternative arts nonprofit. And so I think that sort of puts you into this weird state of like cynical hopefulness or something, you know, where you know, I think if you're a critic, you know, I am often a critic, you know, you can just sort of be, you know, say kind of platonically what you want in the world. But then when you're an ED, you're like, oh, well, now I have this budget, I have this problem, like, what do I do with it? You know, and I sort of felt like one thing that was really interesting in the book is this, like, there's this ethos of like, you really want like a democratic artistic politics, you know, and like, how do you get there in a way that's not utopian? Do you know what I mean? And so it's sort of like, you're like a bricoleur of nonprofit stuff, you know, nonprofit bricoleur, where you're like, oh, well, this thing could work, you know, this thing is cool. Like I was thinking about, you know, the now famous like Claire Bishop and like Nikki Columbus article in N+1, where it's like, this could be like the utopian version of MoMA. And in a way, what's interesting is like, I feel like there's like a subtext in the book where you're occasionally doing stuff like kind of like that. Like this would be a cool thing to do. But what I think is actually harder but maybe less flashy is it's not a utopian thing. It's like, you know, as ED, you know, in Queens, like I thought this was really important, you know. And I guess one thing I was thinking about is just how a lot of these problems, like there are ways of talking about them as like being about like a specific person being awful, like
Right.
panders, you know. But I feel like it's all baked into the economic model of the art museum in a place where there's no like social democratic funding or like public ownership of art, you know. And so like, I'm sure, I don't know if you have this, but I have a lot of like people who are like, I want to start a nonprofit, you know, what should I do? Or I'm a grassroots art collective, you know, and I'm usually like, don't become a nonprofit.
Don't become a nonprofit.
Yeah, right. And then, but they're like, well, I want to get paid. And I'm like, oh, well, you see, there's sort of like, either way you're damned. You can be like a cool art collective. You can be like Decolonize This Place, Chinatown Art Brigade, you know, whatever. And then you will just have no capital. You have no money to do things and you won't get paid for your labor. You can be like a medium tier nonprofit where you have some capital, but everyone, including the ED, probably will be like immiserated. Or you can have a lot of capital, but then you inevitably will just have like douchebags who are evil, who are giving you the capital, you know? And so I sort of felt like, you know, a lot of times when there are protests, it ends up being about like, this person is awful, or like, you know, this director is, you know, a douchebag. But I sort of feel like these things are just sort of baked into the model of how capital flows into this kind of, you know, corporate entity. And I feel like you were kind of trying to pick out little threads of like, well, that's true. And while we're in that situation, until we have universal funding for the arts, you know, here are different things that we could do. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. And also, we don't necessarily need universal funding for the arts because I also think that model creates other problems.
Yeah, and you talk about that in an interesting way.
You know, I'm not sure. I think we need a diversity of sources of funds is always a great thing. You know, as our friends in the foundation universe always encourage us to do as nonprofit EDs. I think the the issue is in part the nonprofit, obviously, and the role that it plays in our society in relationship to capital, and that's always been I remember at one point I heard a museum director say, well, it's time for me to break out my knee pads again, and this was like something he said all the time. And I was just like, whoa, okay. But, I think that there is, a parallel problem of donors feeling like everybody thinks they're an ATM machine, and staffs and other folks thinking like they're so wealthy they don't give nearly enough, and that is a problem perhaps of the tax code and of the billionaire problem that Aruna and I talk about, the billionaire problem being a policy, billionaires being a policy failure in the book, because that's really clear to me that, we've gone way beyond the kind of, if the tax code went back to what it was in the 70s, we'd have a very different universe that we're looking at, but that's not the case. And so how do we function in that, how do we move that needle? Because that would have all kinds of other benefits in society. And Aruna, I agree with you that has to happen. But in the meanwhile, I guess I'm not willing to quite throw out the baby with the bathwater on the cultural institution for that, because I feel like maybe there's a rollback that can happen there. But maybe I'm just naive. But yeah, Ken, I think you're pointing something out. I really was trying to negotiate this in-between space that, because I've been in both camps, that I know to be true. And I think there's a practical side to me that says, well, why can't we fix it? Why can't we put our emotional and, some of our collective emotional and intellectual energy into making this better for people, better for the people who work within museums, and better for the people who might want to come to them if they looked and felt different. So yeah, that was really a motivation.
And one thing I was kind of wondering about is sort of like, I feel like there are these hints about like what you think the ideal museum should be, or, like you're not like abolish MoMA, but I feel like there is a sort of like very pragmatic vision of a museum that is not a utopia, but it's all about geography in terms of the museum having this real relationship and accountability with like the community that lives near it, and Queen's Museum is like a great example of that. Like I kind of had my mind blown when like one of the demands you talk about in your book of the Harlem activists is like the Temple of Dendor should be in Harlem, and so, or you talk about like public libraries as this model of a museum, like there should be a museum within like 10 blocks of you, and you should be able to like take something from it,
Yeah.
So I'm like curious if you could talk a little bit about like how a museum can like think about itself in this more like radical geography kind of way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, the idea of the satellite or mobile museum has been around for a very long time. John Cotton Dana, the radical librarian and museum director in the early 20th century, put museum objects in a truck and drove them around and into different neighborhoods, and had folks take a look at them, in their own neighborhoods. He did the same thing with library books. I think he's more famous now as a library reformer in Newark, New Jersey, but I think that there are certainly lessons to be learned. And I think, the same, there were, and Aruna can talk about this more deeply than I can, around the protests around Harlem on My Mind, and the desire of oh my God, who was the director of the Met then?
Thomas Hoving.
Thomas Hoving, Thomas Hoving wanting to take over more public land in Central Park in order to put the Temple of Dendor in there, which, by the way, was that new gallery space was funded by the Sacklers. So, it gets very enmeshed very quickly, but, there were a lot of people who were like, why doesn't the Met make satellites? Why doesn't, and also during the pandemic, there were many people who said, who talked about the satellite projects that did exist being the first ones that were shut down. So I still think that idea is very potent, and I'll say that with relationship to my direct experience at the Queen's Museum, where one of the real successes of Tania Bruguera's Immigrant Movement International project was that it was so successful as a forum for the community that attended it, that it became its own thing, and now it's its own nonprofit, completely separate from or maybe not even a nonprofit. I'm not sure what they decided in the end. I tried to warn them, but I was like, I don't know, maybe you don't want to do. But it spun off and became its own thing, which I thought was really great. And it was funny because I was sort of there right at the end of the time that it was still affiliated with the museum, and I was like, I'm happy to walk you through all of the finances, and I had spreadsheets and in meetings projected in meetings at Immigrant Movement, and after a while people really didn't want to look at I mean, it wasn't the most fun meeting ever, but nonetheless, like I think that was actually a really important thing to say, no, I'll walk you through this. And it's really interesting because I think one of the things that I would sort of advocate for enormously is for budget transparency to be a thing that exists not only inside the museum, so that every single person working at the museum understands how their local budget in terms of what their program is or whatever it is they spend money on or raise money for, they understand how that nets up into the bigger picture and where those expenses go and what costs what, because I think that's really important. The detail on that is actually really fascinating. And maybe I'm a nerd, but I think it's fascinating. And I think it's important to understand. And I'm really curious. One of the things that came out of the Art and Society Census, which we will be having an event for on June 22nd. And there's a kind of document that's come out of all the various working groups in there, that one of the recommendations is to, work out ways to use participatory budgeting, both on a staff level and in a public sense with museums. And I think that is super fascinating as a proposal. I would love to see that. I
want to jump in and just say, just to nuance something that both of you were talking about, which is the satellite model, because I think that, when the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition was proposing a satellite, this idea that the Temple of Dendor should be actually placed in Harlem, or that the Met should be dispersing its parts of its collection to neighborhoods that were neighborhoods with large Black and Hispanic populations, that was different from what John Cotton Dana was doing. Like John Cotton Dana's project in the early 20th century was about assimilation, right? He was sending all those things out so that all the immigrants who were coming from wherever and were landing up, in the larger sort of New York Metropolitan Museum would learn how to be proper Americans, right? Would learn how to buy into this notion of a kind of white American culture. And I think that those kinds of nuances are really important to kind of talk about, because I think that there's ways in which, museums love to imagine outreach through this lens of assimilation, right? To develop audiences, as opposed to understanding that the audience is okay. The audience is just fine. We have to change to respond to them, right? Like we have to change our ways to respond to them. And so I think it is important to kind of draw these distinctions, or at least be really careful about how these models are sort of imagining the relationship.
I think that's really important, extremely important, Aruna. Thank you for making that distinction. And I think one of the things that I'm quite interested in is the division between, and the relationship between the reason for being of museums in the United States being largely about this kind of educational model, meaning that they it was about broadcasting knowledge, about holding knowledge and broadcasting it to various publics, very diverse publics, and as you say, inviting publics who needed to assimilate into the status quo culture, right? And what I'm really interested in, and I think one of the more fascinating aspects of what could be, what we could put on the table in terms of a position that museums could take, is to pull back. And I think many education departments work on this on various levels. But what if it were a museum-wide decision to diversify and create different registers for exchanges with the public, where the public's knowledge is just as valuable as the museums? And I mean that in a very literal sense. How do you make space for that? Because suddenly then it's not just the educational institution, imposing itself. It's like, well, what can we actually learn here?
I just want to make sure we should, go ahead, hand it over to Kelly.
I just want to make sure that Kelly has some time. So thanks, Ken. Kelly, do you want to take over now?
Sure.
Dr. Morgan.
No, this is a perfect segue into, what my thoughts were, in reading the book. Laura, I think it's a really great contribution. I think it's so necessary. There were so many moments where I was like, oh my God, so it was really great. But it is, kind of how you and Aruna began your conversation about, how much you care about institutions, right? I think I'm even more radical than Aruna. I'm on this, I'm set them all on fire. And you really care, right? And, Aruna made the statement about people really caring. And, Miguel Robles Duran said in the chat, it wasn't necessarily broader general publics who expressed that care. It was cultural workers and artists, right? It was those of us who are there. And so it was just kind of we care, right? People do care, but museums very literally do not care about us. And I think you do such a wonderful job of that, in the book, and showing how institutions are these, or can be, right? These very dangerous and harmful machines that happen to us, and then the process, of fighting that, succumbing to that, recovering from that. I think you do such a wonderful job, of that, and really flushing that out, and so because there's this love, I wanted to push you, a little bit more, to talk about kind of why, not that you shouldn't, right? I'm in a very particular place with institutions right now, right?
And we've talked about it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I really value this push, because I think that, the cultural space has always had so much meaning to me. And I just feel like, Kelly, if I want to hang out with you and Aruna and Ken and make a new museum and have it be badass and awesome and do that. Or we could take over something that's out there even and reuse it. I want that. That's what I want. I want you in charge.
Yeah. It's I think we have to build, and I think your book really demonstrates all what I've been calling recently, the mechanisms that happen behind the curtain, right? As to why it's so hard for the four of us to get together and build something new, right? Right. And the issues with the funding models, the issues with, class and race, and, because like you said, we talked about this, where it's okay, I got this idea, but how do we fund it? And then how do we fund it in competition with the Met, MoMA, Whitney, and, thinking of another point of entry, like the way that, Aruna mentioned earlier, like how you write it from such a personal space. And I think that was the other thing, that was the other kind of main thing that drove my, oh my godness, because it is something, that when you love it, when you're dedicated to it, that is so inherent, I think, to who we are as people, not just cultural workers. And as a woman of color, doing that work, as Andrea Chung, says in the chat, it's like, it's so much work and we're always expected to do it. And then when you refuse, that machine reacts right to you again. Right. And as somebody, who took that on, in your position at Queens and kind of stood, for what you believed in, and actually for people, right? Standing up for the immigrant community, across Queens. I think it's very, I've always, thought was really valiant, but it's like demonstrating the why. I think is so important, because I think people see us, like, whether we're, like Aruna was saying earlier, whether we're on Facebook, or Instagram, because I'm totally going ham on Instagram these days, or writing books. Yeah. It's like, I love how the book really demonstrates the like realities of the environment,
Yeah, and I guess I want to, maybe I just want to care less about the history of the museum, not in a amnesiac kind of way, but as in the rules that it imposes. And I want it to be able to behave in a radical way where, if you and I are in a conversation as colleagues and you tell me about my transgression, that my reaction is not the, harm-inducing head snap, typical institutional self-protective one, but one that says, yeah, I'm a product of this society. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I want to undo this with you. And yes, I recognize that I have to take on the lion's share of the work here, and I'm going to do that. Yeah. And so, like, is it even, and maybe that makes me a ridiculous optimist to think that, like, and I guess I don't think of it as overly optimistic because I've been in those positions and I've tried to do that. Maybe I haven't always done it in the best way, but, like, there have been times where I have attempted that, and really, and truly from a place of, humility. And I think there's something that is just inconsistent and just completely anathema to being involved in museums because they're positions of power with humility. And I think that's a huge problem. And that if we don't address that piece either, I think, like with the rest of it, we don't know where to start. And I think we need to start in some ways by beginning to speak really clearly with one another and being able to kind of engage in this conversation,
Yeah. And I think, with that, just even to, like, you and I, it's a new friendship, but, like, we're friends enough for me to say this, that needs to happen with white people. Right? Black people, indigenous people, Asian folks, in the field. We have done that. We have said it for almost a generation, now, so I think you saying it, right, saying, like, this is something that I want to do, in my position, with humility is, like, so important. Like, the example you gave earlier, the senior colleague, at the very prestigious institution is just like, oh, I just don't know what to do. And it's like, ask somebody, or Google something. We never talk about how purposeful it is, right? The Sacklers were following a very traditional framework that is specific to American philanthropy. That's right. So if we're talking about the Sacklers and the opioid crisis, and it's like this aha moment for people, it's because we never talk about the Whitney in relationship to the cotton gin. Right? We never talk about Alice Walton in relationship to lower paid, workers at Walmart.
Yeah.
right? Right. There's a reason, or as Andrea is saying right now, right? Or the Tate and slavery.
Slavery,
It's unbelievable, right? And so like the quote that stood out to me, which is super early in the book, it's on page 13, and you say there seems to be a widespread discomfort around these ideas, as well as fear that cultural institutions and museums will somehow be reduced if their founding biases are made visible. And I write, absolutely, like they absolutely know it. So everything that's being done is being done. It's like this fictive facade in a way, right? To like assert that they don't know, or to like feign this ignorance, that is just infuriating, to me now. And again, so I like how the book really like reveals, how much that, and the fact that you go back, to the origins to demonstrate that, because so much of it is just white leadership and that investment, in like white patriarchal capitalism.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting to me because I've had actually quite a number of people say to me like, well, come on, everybody knows it's not neutral. And it's like, well, actually, some people have so convinced themselves that it still is in order to operate in these like deeply problematic ways. And so how do you convince people to begin to, actually admit that this is a reality, and it sounds so basic, right? It's like, really?
No, but it's a huge problem. Yeah, it's a huge problem. I mean, having been gaslit for the last year and a half, from not just a director, but trustees who absolutely, absolutely, and like in my, whole staff of people, who we're all like, are we crazy? I don't think so. Maybe, and like that, just having to navigate that, in your career, and you're like, I swear I went to school, but yeah, that's a real, like, it was really scary, to see it up close and personal. So I can't imagine, what that looks like for you. Because it was like, wow, they really do believe it. They really do.
They believe it.
Yeah.
So I am going to jump in because we have a robust set of questions from the audience. So I'm going to, we'll probably, just for audience members, we'll probably go about 5 minutes over, just trying to get in as many questions as possible. And I am going to probably skip all of your thanks and appreciation just to be a little faster. And just Laura, everyone offers their thanks and appreciation. So just that's the omnibus declaration. I wanted to ask Laura a question. This is coming from Benjamin Ogrodnik. I wanted to ask Laura a question about the issue of deaccessioning. In your view, does deaccessioning make sense as a strategy for materially improving the lives of museum workers? And the question specifically cites the example of the Baltimore Museum of Art. So do you want to jump in with that?
Yeah, sure. I have very complicated feelings about deaccessioning because, on a lot of levels, I agree with, Tyler Green's critiques of deaccessioning for the sake of letting people off the hook for the kinds of fundraising and money they need to be leveraging to support their actual staffs. I have actually more of an issue. I have more of an issue with deaccessioning than I do accessing board restricted or endowment funds. And I think they're part of like a similar conversation. Endowments, the way that endowments function is that, a corpus of funds is invested in usually in fairly conservative, stock market stocks and mutual funds and other things, managed funds. And the income from that annually is drawn at 4%, typically between 3.5% and 4.5%, 3.5% and 4.5% usually, to help support the operations of a museum, if you're lucky enough to have said endowment. Otherwise, you're raising every penny every year from scratch, right? So, you know, I'm sorry, I'm going away from deaccessioning for a second, just because I think this question of care and curare, as in like to care for artworks, is too narrow. We are talking about a cultural institution, and the institution does not exist without the people who make it happen every day and open its doors. And so to me, the care for people is essential. And so when you have crisis, like the last 18 months, one needs to address it appropriately. And I think, you know, you have to consider what an endowment means if you can't actually care for the employees. And you also have to consider what your collection looks like on a number of different fronts. And I think there's a normal, you know, a completely normal deaccessioning is not a evil thing if it's done within intentionality and around making goals in relationship to your collection. I think that people's desires and they're seeing the holes, the vast holes in their collecting activity over decades, especially in institutions that have major collections, and they want to make changes. I think that there are reasonable numbers of deaccession of sales of work that can be made in order to shore up the collection in other areas where, you know, and that's a practice that's gone on for ages. You know, where I think there's a problem is when there are sales of works just to plug holes in operating budgets. I think that that's an issue. You know, I think that if you need to plug a hole in an operating budget, you should take it out of your endowment if you have one, as opposed to selling work. But like, you know, these are also, but I also think you just fundamentally need to care for your people. So, you know, to me, that's the challenge of a director and their board, to understand how that all functions. And I think those conversations should be had with the staff as well, especially during a crisis, you know, as to how that's being handled.
I'm going to jump in with the next question. So we have a question from Greg Chalette. Marcia Tucker innovated allowing all of the new museum staff to provide input about upcoming exhibition schedules. It was done away with in the late 90s as the institution professionalized and she was leaving her director's role. But is it possible to imagine bringing back such horizontal structures for US museums, scrambling to find every foundation or museum visitor dollar?
You know, obviously I've read about and talked to folks about who were on that staff and you know, did the kind of rotating job description thing, and everyone I talked to said it was pretty chaotic, although probably very informative. I mean, everyone who I spoke to talked about it as being informative but chaotic. You know, I think that experiment was really important. I think maybe just actually knowing what your colleagues do, we could maybe just start there. I think that the siloing of museum departments is so extreme in contemporary museums and cultural spaces that literally people don't understand what anyone else does. You know, one of the very basic things we did at the Queen's Museum was at different staff, we had an all staff meeting once a month, and each different department presented. And, you know, it was a staff of like 45 people, 50 people. So it wasn't like a huge number, but it at least got us all in the same room together talking about what was and who was who and what was going on in everybody's world. So you knew operationally what was happening, and you knew, you know, curatorially what was happening and education-wise. But, you know, the kind of attempts to de-silo and to force kind of deeper collaboration and knowledge across those departments is like super important. You know, I think what Marcia Tucker did was extraordinary and certainly a really important experiment. I'm not sure that I would try it if given the opportunity.
Okay, I'm skipping around a bit in the question.
Can I add something really, really quickly?
Yeah, of course.
At Newfields, we worked in what was called a core team structure that I think was mastermind by a woman by the name of Jen Mayhill and another woman by the name of Tasha Horowitz, who at the beginning of any program, exhibition, whatever, there's one representative from every department, and then we rotate as we move through the exhibition. It was the one there were other fabulous things about working there, but it was the one fabulous thing, and it was connected to our budget process, right? So we could kind of use budgets as moral documents and stuff like that. So there are models out there. If people want those resources, I can send them.
Awesome.
Thank you. The only thing I have to say about horizontal structures is I worked in an organization where the person at the top insisted that they hated hierarchy. And at one of the staff meetings, someone blurted out, "You hate hierarchy, but you always insist on being at the top," to this director. And it was kind of true. It was the director was at the top and then everyone else was horizontal, and that wasn't actually a great model either. But I'm going to jump to another question from Aviva Ramani about changing the model. What about the gallery system that often acts as a gatekeeper for what and whose work is shown? And I think this is a really interesting question, that as long as there is this for-profit gallery model that operates the way it does, to what extent is changing the museum model even possible?
Yeah, I think, Aviva, that's tied into all of the threads that we've kind of been looking at, particularly the kind of smallness of our imagination about what can be included in museums. And I think there is a great advantage to kind of exploring other methodologies of going outside of those systems. That's just essential. And the gallery universe is, one that, is very potent, especially in relationship to the collectors who then inevitably end up on the boards. So, this is all embedded.
An anonymous attendee has asked, I'm reading this because of the first line, "I love D'Souza's macro approach, i.e. eliminate billionaires first. But until then," here's the kicker, "how can cultural institutions respond to protests in ways that keep responses proportionate to internal resources? While cultural orgs can and should address issues like racism within programming and organizational culture, sometimes I find public demands can come with expectations that cultural organizations are not equipped to fix, and it strains/drains them. For example, expectations to reject major corporate gifts while improving programming, accessibility, wages for cultural workers, etc. And I would just add to this question, one of the things that's really interesting to me about the current action strike MoMA is that the kind of the issues that I don't want to say demands, because I don't think that they're actually demands. I think that the issues the protesters, the coalition of protesters is bringing up are actually so capacious, right? That I think they fall into this category of individual institutions maybe not being able to address them meaningfully, but what's the responsibility of institutions to these larger questions of civic, political, social transformation?
I think there's a huge responsibility towards it. I think that we have to retune how we respond. I think that, look, there's a huge conflict that's happened right now within the cultural sphere, because every cultural institution that I know of thinks it's precarious financially, even if, many smaller institutions would look at the bigger ones and say what, you're fine, we're really precarious. And then there's always somebody who's, lower down on the food chain. But we can stop doing everything. And I think part of slowing down is also producing a bit less so we can do more. And I think that if the pandemic has taught me anything, it's about the power of that slowing down to really do deeper work. And I think that when you're looking at spending resources, we all of us that have been inside cultural institutions know the pressure of production, and it's like produce. And can we just do a little bit less, but do it better, and do it thinking through the actual implications of the choices that we're making? Because I think that the speed at which culture functions often produces the real problems of inequity and how they surface, because everybody thinks, especially white people, that, oh, I can just make that call, but actually you can't. You should talk to people about it. You should think it through. You should think about it together and not actually just, shoot from the hip, and I think, here is where, the Sam Durant example really plays in, because I think, what would have happened if there was a slowing down during the process of acquiring that work? What would have happened if, members of the Dakota community who were, even if they weren't known to personally to people inside the Walker, I mean, they perhaps should have been. And what about starting a relationship over this artwork that was being considered for acquisition? And what might that have led to? I mean, what might that have conversation have led to? That's sort of a very obvious example, but I think there's so much that one can accomplish just by taking a few things off of the calendar, doing things a little bit more deeply, and inviting the people in the conversation that really need to be there. Even if you don't know who those people are, maybe trying to figure it out.
I would also say that actually showing the work of Indigenous artists who are dealing with those histories, as opposed to a white male artist who's dealing with those histories, might be another way of dealing with that problem. Like, it's to me, that was such an interesting conversation in the book, because you interviewed Sam for that, and he said something about sort of feeling blindsided, not knowing the proximity to the Dakota community when that piece went up. And I was thinking, how far do you have to be, from the community for that to be okay? And so
in that particular case, I think he was comparing it to its presence at Documenta, where the other, I mean, the majority of the iconography of the piece was from the Dakota. So having it be on unceded Dakota land was obviously going to be an issue. So yes, of course. But, if they were going to acquire that work, they should have had the conversations about all of the aspects of that particular function. But yeah, I agree with you. Obviously, commission if you want to work about, that engages with some history like a massacre of Indigenous people, maybe ask an Indigenous person to do the work.
And can I say that too, where it's like this, it's a going back to the whole idea of care, right? It's like an uncaring. Yep. So they don't matter. I don't have to ask.
That's right.
So I can make the work. Walker can show the work. Everybody can do everything they want to do with this work, because they don't exist anyway. And even when they did exist, they existed only as we needed them to. Yeah. As display, as object, right? All of that sordid history. And I think, we never really, I'm always trying to get at, again, how purposeful of a choice it is.
Yep.
And then the fallout happens, and it's like, oh, I didn't think about it. Same thing with the Dana Schutz example in that same chapter, and I'm just like, wasn't necessarily so much that she didn't know, she just didn't want to own that she did. Right.
Right. And she chose to claim the positionality of the mother as something that was, the decision, but I think, again, this is just, desire to not take on the position of humility and to say, you know, maybe this isn't the subject that I should be addressing.
Well, I don't even know that I think it's a matter of the ownership of a subject, but that I think that now the work, like, what is the work of an artist, right? The work of an artist is actually to engage, right? Like, I think that, you know, even if you're a painter, even if, you know, painters who make purely abstract works are engaging with a history of their medium, with other abstract painters, with you know, with a community of art lovers, right? There's engagement, right? And so it's a question of who people are deciding, and this is what I think, Kelly, Dr. Morgan, I'd like to call you. What Dr. Morgan is talking about is the question. I mean, there's an interesting aspect of this, which is that the question of who you see as necessary to engage in the process that you're taking part in. Like, I remember, you know, back when the controversy around the Whitney Biennial in 2017 happened, having a conversation with people in the education department who were trying to think about, you know, and they were being asked to put together programming that allowed the audience to contextualize the protests. And I was so confused because I was like, well, the audience is protesting. They're the ones who are protesting, right? But there was this sort of interesting slippage where there wasn't a sense of, like, you know, just as you say that the people who are protesting are part of the institution, the people who are protesting are also the audience for the institution. Some of the people who are protesting are working at the institution, right? Like that there are all of these multiple positionalities, and that the question of who you're thinking needs to be engaged is always sort of up for questions. Now that I've said
that one, sorry,
no, go
really quick. I think the other thing about engagement too, and we're particularly talking about these particular works, is when historically that engagement from the larger society has been extermination and genocide. Extermination, like very literal physical erasure, death, homicide, right? Like, then a responsibility for engagement becomes that much more, you know, critical.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to take an unauthorized last question from Nick Mirzov. Thanks for this. I'd really like to hear your thoughts about restitution of cultural property and how that could be made into a positive way to reconfigure the cultural institution going forward. So.
Wow, that's a good question, Nick. Well, restitution of cultural property is obviously something that is absolutely essential. It's something that is not even an option in my book. I mean, that just has to happen. The idea that, you know, all these institutions are afraid they're going to end up with empty galleries. Well, you know what? That's just too bad if that happens. You know? And, you know, I think that, you know, one of the interesting aspects to look at is what's happened, you know, with Greek and Egyptian restitution, because, you know, there have been many attempts to return certain Greek and Egyptian looted objects that Greece and Egypt have just been like, no, that's okay, you can keep that one. You know? So, you know, I think that there is, you know, a very powerful need to do that where it hasn't been done already. And you know, places like the Met have a real responsibility to do that, not just with the 3 pieces that they recently returned, but with all the works that have questionable provenance in their collection. And this is like a very deep long-term project. And it has to be done with care and with thought, and it has to be done completely, in my view.
Well, on that note, I think that we have to, I'm going to turn things back over to our host, one of our hosts, Cora. Thank you to, just let me say, thank you to Kelly and Ken, and of course, Laura, congratulations on your the launch of your book.
Thank you. And I want to thank you all for being here. The chat is completely amazing. And I kind of want a copy of it. I don't know, Cora, if we can organize that, but many of you have been posting really fascinating and awesome comments. So just thank you for your participation. And of course, Aruna for doing all the hard work and Kelly and Ken for being interlocutors. It's been just an enormous pleasure. Just thank you, thank you, thank you.
I couldn't echo the sentiment more. I feel just elevated by this conversation, being able to be in everyone's intellectual presence. It is why we do the work that we do at the library. And this is the top representation of what we can be doing. So thank you so much for this evening, everyone. I wanted to also share in our chat, Biniam is going to post some links for future events. Please join us on the 22nd. Laura is going to be co-hosting along with some of the folks who are in our audience tonight, Kazembe Balagun among them, an important Congress on Life and Art in which we will continue this conversation. And again, I just honored to be in everyone's presence. Thank you all, be safe, be well, and we'll speak again soon. Good night.
Good night. Thanks, everyone. Wish we were all having a drink right now.
Soon.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.